James Cleveland was the king of gospel, a living saint who built a multi-million-dollar religious empire. But the man preaching salvation was secretly gay, hiding male lovers in his mansion as adopted sons. While his church publicly damned AIDS victims as filthy sinners, their holy king was secretly rotting from the exact same disease. The church knew he was dying, but they dragged his sick body onto the stage to keep making millions until his final breath. When AIDS finally killed him in 1991, the institution forged his death certificate to say heart failure, paid off his lovers with hush money, and ruthlessly buried his tragic reality to protect their holy empire. James Edward Cleveland was born on December 5, 1931. Raised in the shadows of the city's towering brick churches, his entire worldview was forged within the pews. For a young child with an innate, almost gravitational pull toward music, the church was the only patron of the arts that mattered. From a very early age, Cleveland demonstrated an extraordinary vocal capacity. He possessed a clear, piercing boy soprano voice. In the tradition of the Baptist Church, music was not a passive performance. It was a grueling physical act of spiritual warfare and communal catharsis. The young James Cleveland took this responsibility with absolute terrifying seriousness. He pushed his small frame to produce volumes and upper register notes that consistently defied his physical maturity. Sunday after Sunday, revival after revival, Cleveland sang with a ferocious intensity. Medical historians and vocal experts who later analyze his career note that this period of his life was defined by severe, unchecked vocal abuse. Without formal vocal coaching to teach him breath support or the mechanics of safe projection, the young boy systematically destroyed his own vocal cords. The constant straining caused severe hemorrhaging and the development of permanent nodules. The damage was irreversible. The soaring, pristine soprano was entirely eradicated. In its place emerged a scarred, severely restricted, and heavily textured baritone. It was a voice that sounded as though it had been dragged over broken glass, a raspy, guttural instrument that carried the unmistakable auditory scar tissue of his childhood devotion. Yet this physical injury would pale in comparison to the psychological parameters the church was simultaneously establishing around him. The mid-century religious environment was a fortress of extreme conservatism. For a marginalized community under constant scrutiny from a hostile white majority, strict moral adherence was viewed as a necessary shield. Any deviation from the traditional patriarchal family structure was seen not just as a sin against God, but as a direct threat to the social standing and cohesion of the community. Within this theological framework, homosexuality was categorized as the ultimate transgression. It was an unspeakable moral failing, routinely and violently condemned from the pulpit. James Cleveland recognized his own sexual orientation at a young age. This realization arrived concurrently with a terrifying, immovable truth. To exist as a gay man in the 1940s and 1950s was to invite severe societal punishment. But to exist as a gay man within the strict confines of the mid-century black church was to risk absolute exile. Cleveland was faced with an impossible ultimatum before he even reached adulthood. The church was his only pathway out of the crushing poverty of the South Side. It was the only environment that recognized his musical genius, the only place that offered him respect, and the only platform where he could utilize his battered, unique voice. To claim his authentic identity meant sacrificing his entire world, his livelihood, and his connection to the divine. To choose the church meant agreeing to self-imposed psychological captivity. He chose the church. To secure his survival and his future, the young James Cleveland began the agonizing process of compartmentalization. He learned to bury his internal reality beneath an impenetrable layer of orthodox piety. He began to monitor his every movement, his associations, and his public demeanor constructing a highly sanitized public facade. Simultaneously, he channeled this immense internal pressure directly into his musical education. In the late 1940s and 1950s, he began to study under Thomas A. Dorsey, the man widely acknowledged as the father of traditional gospel music. Dorsey was the music director at Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago, and he had controversially begun infusing sacred hymns with the rhythmic structures of secular blues and jazz. Cleveland absorbed this revolutionary approach and began to push it even further. Even with his vocal cords permanently damaged, Cleveland's understanding of musical arrangement was unparalleled. He learned the piano, heavily influenced by the percussive driving style of Roberta Martin. He began to write and arrange for established gospel groups, including the Caravans and the Gospelaires. He was pioneering a new sound, modern gospel, by layering complex, emotionally wrenching, secular chord progressions underneath traditional biblical lyrics. As the 1950s drew to a close, James Cleveland was steadily building a formidable reputation within the national gospel circuit. His arrangements were increasingly sought after, and his distinct raspy voice was becoming recognizable to congregations far beyond Chicago. He was laying the foundation for an unprecedented musical empire, but every brick of that foundation was mortared with the necessity of silence. He was entering his 30s, poised on the edge of unimaginable fame and influence, but he was entirely locked within a psychological cage of his own design. The platform that was about to make him a legend was the very same institution that strictly forbade him from existing truthfully in the daylight. The transition from a highly respected musical arranger to an undisputed institutional monarch occurred definitively in the early 1960s. James Cleveland had spent the previous decade meticulously studying the mechanics of congregational response, learning exactly how to manipulate tempo and chord structures to elicit maximum emotional output from an audience. In 1963, this localized expertise was translated into a national broadcast. He partnered with the angelic choir of the First Baptist Church of Nutley, New Jersey, to record a live album. The title track, Peace Be Still, was a masterclass in tension and release. Cleveland took a traditional, somewhat sedate hymnal and completely reconstructed its architecture. He slowed the tempo to an agonizing crawl, allowing the choir to build a wall of sound behind him while his heavily damaged raspy baritone cut through the arrangement with a raw, desperate authority. The commercial response to Peace Be Still shattered every existing metric for religious music. It bypassed the traditional boundaries of the gospel market, achieving unprecedented crossover success and selling over 1 million copies. The record remained on the Billboard charts for an astonishingly long duration, proving to record executives that religious music, when anchored by a charismatic central figure, possessed massive, untapped economic viability. This specific commercial triumph fundamentally altered Cleveland's trajectory. He was no longer merely a talented accompanist or a regional choir director. He had become a highly lucrative recording artist. The sudden influx of capital and national recognition provided him with the leverage to transition from working within existing religious structures to building his own. His ascent to the absolute pinnacle of mainstream cultural visibility occurred in January 1972 inside the New Temple Missionary Baptist Church in Los Angeles. Aretha Franklin, at the absolute height of her global fame, decided to record a live gospel album, returning to the musical roots that had forged her voice. To execute this monumental project, Amazing Grace Franklin and her producers knew there was only one man capable of managing the musical and spiritual weight of the recording sessions. James Cleveland was brought in to direct the Southern California Community Choir and to serve as the master of ceremonies. Documentary footage from those 2 nights of recording provides a pristine, unfiltered look at Cleveland's operational command. He did not merely conduct the choir, he physically and psychologically dominated the room. He taught the complex, multi-part vocal arrangements entirely by ear, utilizing a call and response method that demanded absolute, unwavering attention from the singers. Standing in front of the congregation, he managed the immense pressure of a major label recording session, complete with microphone placements, lighting rigs, and secular film crews, while simultaneously maintaining the authentic, chaotic spiritual energy of a traditional Baptist service. When the album was released, it became the highest-selling live gospel album of all time. Cleveland's role in its success cemented his public image not just as a musician, but as the supreme architect of the American gospel sound. This cultural capital was rapidly consolidated into a tangible, bureaucratic empire. Recognizing that the gospel music industry was highly fragmented, with local choirs and songwriters operating in isolated silos across the country, Cleveland engineered a massive centralization effort. In 1967, he founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America. The GMWA was not a choir. It was a sprawling corporate infrastructure. It functioned as a national syndication network, a publishing house, and a professional guild for gospel artists. Through the GMWA, Cleveland controlled the distribution of sheet music, dictated the stylistic trends of the genre, and held the power to launch or stall the careers of thousands of aspiring musicians. To be recognized by the GMWA was the primary prerequisite for national success in the gospel industry. As its founder and absolute leader, Cleveland sat at the apex of a multi-million-dollar revenue engine. In 1970, he expanded his authority from the musical realm directly into the ecclesiastical, founding the Cornerstone Institutional Baptist Church in Los Angeles. He transitioned from Reverend, entitled to a functioning full-time pastor. His congregation swelled, drawing thousands of attendees who came not just for the theology, but to be in the physical presence of the King of Gospel. The financial rewards of this dual empire were staggering. By the mid-1970s, Cleveland had accumulated a personal net worth estimated at over $6 million. He lived in a sprawling, heavily guarded mansion in Southern California, traveled with a dedicated entourage, and wore impeccably tailored suits. He had achieved the ultimate American ascension, rising from the crushing poverty of the Chicago South Side to a position of immense wealth and unassailable social standing. However, the architecture of this specific type of success created a highly specialized, intensely claustrophobic psychological trap. Unlike a secular pop star whose wealth affords him a degree of moral leniency and private rebellion, Cleveland's entire economic and social empire was explicitly underwritten by his perceived spiritual purity. The church, particularly the mid-century Black Baptist denomination, operated as a rigorous moral surveillance system. The congregation did not just pay him to sing, they tithed to him to serve as their direct conduit to the divine. The higher he climbed, the thicker the mask had to become. He was elevated to the status of a living saint, a figurehead, upon whom the community projected its ideals of absolute orthodox holiness. The expectations were totalizing. He could not be seen engaged in any secular vice, he could not express theological doubt, and, above all, he had to present an image of traditional, unblemished masculinity. This required Cleveland to exist in a state of perpetual performance. The stage was no longer confined to the recording studio or the concert hall. The stage was his entire life. When he stood behind the pulpit at Cornerstone, or when he addressed the thousands of delegates at the annual GMWA conventions, he was required to deliver sermons that reinforced the strict conservative doctrines of his faith. He had to look into the eyes of his congregants and loudly condemn the very desires that were foundational to his own private identity. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this dual reality was immense. To operate his empire, he had to actively participate in the enforcement of the very moral codes that condemned him to isolation. He counseled church members on their traditional marriages. He preached on the sanctity of the Orthodox family unit, and he led prayers for spiritual deliverance from moral failings, all while carrying a private truth that, if exposed, would instantly dismantle his entire life's work. Behind the fortified walls of his Southern California mansion, James Cleveland existed within a heavily guarded, highly complex social ecosystem. The public recognized him as a solitary, devoted steward of the gospel, a man who had seemingly forgotten a traditional domestic life to dedicate himself entirely to the church. However, within the insular upper echelons of the gospel music industry and his immediate inner circle, his reality was vastly different. His sexual orientation was what sociologists and cultural historians often define as an open secret. It was a fundamental truth widely understood by those who worked alongside him, toured with him, and managed his finances, yet it remained absolutely bound by a strict unspoken covenant of institutional silence. This enforced silence was not unique to Cleveland's estate. It was a systemic feature of the era. The reality of his private life during the 1970s and 1980s was inextricably bound to the specific mechanics of the down-low culture, a clandestine network operating deep within conservative religious frameworks. The term, which would later gain mainstream sociological recognition, described a highly structured clandestine network of men who maintained the outward appearance of traditional heteronormative lives, often holding prominent positions in their communities, marriages, and churches, while secretly engaging in same-sex relationships. Within the Black church, where the pressure of respectability politics was immense and the theological condemnation of homosexuality was absolute, this underground network was a necessary mechanism for psychological survival. The consequences of public exposure were catastrophic. Immediate excommunication, the loss of social standing, and the total destruction of one's professional livelihood. Consequently, men who navigated this space developed sophisticated methods of recognizing one another, communicating, and securing private spaces away from the watchful eyes of their congregations. Ironically, the very institutions that demanded their suppression often provided the cover for their gatherings. The massive national conventions, late-night choir rehearsals, and extensive touring schedules of the gospel circuit inadvertently created a vast, invisible geography where these men could momentarily interact. As the preeminent figure in this industry, Cleveland occupied a highly precarious position within this hidden world. His immense wealth and status provided him with a level of insulation, but they also severely limited his freedom. He could not risk being seen at underground clubs or private, unvetted gatherings to navigate his need for companionship without triggering the moral alarm bells of his congregation. Biographers and contemporaries note that a specific pattern emerged within his private life. Cleveland frequently brought young male singers, musicians, and chorister directors into his residence. To the public, the church, and the press, this was framed through the highly respected, culturally sanctioned lens of mentorship. These young men were officially designated as his protégés, and in some instances they were referred to within the church community as his adopted sons. This arrangement provided a socially acceptable alibi, framing the presence of young men in his residence as Christian charity and professional development. But this specific method of survival extracted a devastating emotional toll. He possessed the power to command thousands from the pulpit and orchestrate multi-million-dollar recording sessions. Yet he lacked the basic human freedom to walk down the street alongside someone he loved. The sprawling Southern California estate was not a sanctuary. It was a lavishly decorated, heavily surveilled holding cell. He could offer employment and industry access to the men in his orbit, but never public acknowledgement. The relationships forged in this environment were inherently asymmetrical, shadowed always by the looming threat of discovery. Cleveland had achieved the ultimate American ascension, yet his daily existence remained dictated by the unyielding terms of his secret. His sprawling estate offered luxury, but it fundamentally lacked the one privilege his wealth could not buy: the freedom to live openly. The immense psychological pressure generated by this fractured existence could not be entirely contained. The human mind requires an outlet for sustained chronic trauma. For James Cleveland, the only authorized space where he possessed absolute control was his music. Denied the ability to speak his truth in the daylight, he poured the entirety of his suppressed reality into his musical architecture. When musicologists and cultural historians critically dissect his primary compositional era of the 1970s and 1980s, a striking pattern emerges. His discography from this period functions as a profound coded confession. On the surface, the lyrics strictly adhered to the theological requirements of his denomination. They spoke of heaven, of salvation, of relying on the Lord, and of enduring earthly trials. However, the sonic structure beneath those lyrics frequently contradicted the triumphant, joyous message typically associated with gospel music. Cleveland became a master of emotional dissonance. He systematically infused his arrangements with a heavy, melancholic atmosphere. He utilized complex descending chord progressions that had more in common with the tragic laments of the secular blues than the celebratory anthems of the church. He arranged his background choirs to swell and recede like heavy ocean waves, creating a dense, suffocating wall of sound. Against this backdrop, he would place his own voice, ragged, breathless, and agonizingly slow. He stretched syllables to their breaking point, utilizing a heavily textured vibrato that effectively simulated the auditory experience of weeping. The thematic motifs within his most resonant songs also carried a dual meaning. While the congregation heard biblical allegories, those who understood the reality of his life recognized a starkly autobiographical narrative. The motif of the lonely wanderer or the weary traveler became a central pillar of his catalog. Songs like Lord, Help Me to Hold Out, or I Don't Feel No Ways Tired were ostensibly prayers for spiritual endurance in the face of generic worldly hardship. Yet delivered through Cleveland's specific, agonizing vocal interpretations, they functioned as literal cries for survival from a queer man trapped within an unyielding traditional institution. He sang obsessively about being a stranger in a foreign land, about seeking a home that he could not yet see, and about the sheer, exhausting physical weight of carrying a burden that no one else could understand. He was utilizing the sanctioned vocabulary of the church to articulate the specific, localized agony of the closet. The musical tension in these recordings is palpable. It is the sound of a man pushing against the very boundaries of his cage, trying to broadcast his humanity without triggering the tripwires that would destroy him. This was the ultimate tragic paradox of James Cleveland's prime era. He stood before the nation as a spiritual titan. His voice was the designated anchor for a marginalized community, providing strength, comfort, and emotional release for millions of Black Americans navigating the systemic struggles of the mid-20th century. He was the healer to whom an entire demographic turned in times of profound grief. Yet the man engineering this mass catharsis was entirely hollowed out by his own unresolved, unspoken pain. He constructed magnificent, sprawling sanctuaries of sound where millions of people could lay down their burdens and find safety. But within the rigid empire of faith he had built, he had not left a single safe corner for himself. The precarious, carefully balanced equilibrium that defined James Cleveland's existence and the existence of thousands of men within the gospel music industry was violently upended in the early 1980s. The arrival of the HIV/AIDS epidemic did not merely represent a public health crisis. It introduced a profound existential terror that fundamentally altered the social and political landscape of the United States. In its earliest years, the virus was characterized by intense medical uncertainty, a complete lack of viable treatments, and a highly aggressive mortality rate. However, the biological devastation of the disease was almost immediately eclipsed by the intense sociological stigma attached to it. Because the epidemic initially presented most visibly within the gay community, mainstream society frequently responded with severe apathy, while conservative institutions responded with outright hostility. Nowhere was this hostility more organized and absolute than within the conservative religious institutions of America, including the Orthodox Black Church. The pulpits that had historically served as headquarters for civil rights and community uplift rapidly transformed into platforms for severe moral condemnation. Throughout the 1980s, church leadership frequently framed the epidemic not as a devastating illness requiring medical intervention and pastoral care, but as a deliberate divine reckoning. The disease was routinely described as a physical manifestation of moral decay. The hypocrisy of the institutional response was absolute and economically driven. The architectural reality of the Black church was that its musical infrastructure, the choir directors, the organists, the principal vocalists, was heavily populated by the very men forced into the shadows of the down-low network. The ecclesiastical machinery enthusiastically consumed their artistry, utilizing their genius to build massive congregations and generate substantial institutional wealth. Yet when these same musicians began to fall ill, the financial convenience of willful blindness mutated into decisive systemic abandonment. Men who had scored the soundtrack to the denomination's greatest triumphs were quietly dismissed, shunned by their congregations, and denied the dignity of funeral services within the sanctuaries they had helped build. The machinery protected its revenue streams by violently amputating its most vulnerable architects. This climate of absolute theological condemnation forced an already deeply closeted community further into the shadows. The systemic mandate of silence regarding homosexuality now extended to the virus itself. Because the church forbade any open discussion of sexual orientation, there could be no public health education, no distribution of preventative information, and no organized medical support networks within the community. Consequently, the institution inadvertently engineered the exact conditions necessary for a catastrophic public health disaster. The massive national infrastructure of the gospel industry, the very infrastructure James Cleveland had pioneered and centralized, became the primary, unmonitored conduit for the virus. The annual Gospel Music Workshop of America conventions, which drew tens of thousands of delegates, choir members, and industry professionals from across the nation to a single city for a week of intensive rehearsals and performances, were also the central gathering points for the clandestine down-low network. Away from the watchful eyes of their local congregations, men utilized these conventions to seek the companionship they were otherwise denied. The strict enforcement of silence meant that individuals were entirely unequipped to navigate the emerging health crisis. They could not discuss their symptoms. They could not warn their partners, and they lived in absolute terror of seeking medical testing, knowing that a positive diagnosis would result in immediate, total, social, and professional ruin. As the undisputed patriarch of this entire ecosystem, James Cleveland occupied the absolute center of this unfolding tragedy. Throughout the mid to late 1980s, he was forced to witness the quiet, systematic decimation of his industry. He watched peers, collaborators, and the young men who moved through the orbit of his choir slowly succumb to sudden, unexplained bouts of pneumonia and severe weight loss. He attended the funerals of colleagues where the true cause of death was hastily obscured by medical euphemisms, participating in the collective institutional lie. Then, the epidemic breached the heavily guarded walls of his own sanctuary. Sometime in the late 1980s, it became known within the highest, most confidential echelons of his inner circle that James Cleveland had contracted the HIV virus. The diagnosis of the King of Gospel presented an unprecedented crisis, not merely for the man, but for the multi-million-dollar empire that bore his name. The Cornerstone Institutional Baptist Church and the GMWA were entirely dependent on his public image. His authority, his financial credit, and his capacity to draw thousands to national conventions were predicated on his status as a living vessel of orthodox holiness. If the public, the press, or the broader congregation discovered that their supreme spiritual leader was suffering from a disease the church had loudly condemned as the ultimate sinner's affliction, the resulting scandal would not just end his career, it would instantly collapse his entire institutional apparatus. The financial ruin would extend far beyond Cleveland himself, impacting the livelihoods of the board members, the tour promoters, the church administrators, and the vast network of employees who managed his estate. Faced with this existential threat, the operational machinery surrounding Cleveland engaged in a strategy of absolute containment. Institutional self-preservation took immediate precedence over the declining health of the man. A strict, impenetrable media blackout was enforced regarding his physical condition. Medical care was managed with extreme discretion, utilizing private physicians who were willing to operate outside of standard hospital tracking systems to ensure the diagnosis remained entirely off the public record. To explain his increasingly visible physical deterioration to the public, his management and advisory board crafted a sanitized, highly controlled narrative. The official press releases and church bulletins attributed his sudden weight loss, his chronic fatigue, and his frequent respiratory struggles to some severe exhaustion, overwork, and a generic heart condition. The congregation and the fans were told that the Reverend was simply working himself to the bone for the glory of the ministry. This carefully constructed lie required Cleveland to perform the most agonizing role of his life. To maintain the illusion that the empire was stable, he could not be allowed to retreat or rest. The institutional calendar remained unforgiving. Despite his immune system failing and his body weakening from the aggressive onslaught of the virus, he was continuously propped up. He was scheduled for high-profile sermons, required to travel to regional choir anniversaries, and expected to preside over the grueling, multi-day GMWA conventions. Observers from that period recall the jarring, heartbreaking contrast between his public obligations and his physical reality. He was required to stand behind the pulpit of Cornerstone, dressed in his immaculate clerical robes, and project spiritual invincibility, while secretly fighting a fatal, stigmatized disease. The heavy theatrical makeup used for his television appearances was now utilized to mask the severe facial wasting associated with late-stage immune deficiency. The most devastating impact, however, was on his voice, the very instrument that had built his empire. The raspy, powerful baritone that had commanded arenas required immense diaphragm strength and breath control. As the virus attacked his respiratory system, robbing him of his lung capacity, he could no longer sustain the long, emotional phrasing that defined his music. He found himself gasping for air between verses, his vocal runs cutting off abruptly. Yet the show was mandated to go on. James Cleveland was trapped in a terrifying Kafkaesque reality. The institution he had built to provide spiritual salvation to the masses had transformed into a relentless, unfeeling machine. It demanded that he literally work himself to death in plain sight, utilizing the final reserves of his physical strength to protect the financial and reputational capital of an empire that would immediately disown him if it ever knew his truth. He was forced to suffer the absolute worst of the epidemic in complete crowded isolation, denied the grace, the comfort, and the honesty that he had spent his entire life preaching to others. As the calendar turned to the year 1990, the landscape of American music was undergoing a rapid, highly polished evolution. The gospel industry, which James Cleveland had almost single-handedly dragged into the commercial mainstream decades earlier, was shifting toward a sleek, contemporary, urban sound. Yet, while the genre accelerated into the future, its founding patriarch was fundamentally stalling. The dawn of the new decade found Cleveland trapped in a deeply agonizing holding pattern. The physical toll of his dual existence, compounded by the aggressive, unchecked advancement of the HIV virus, could no longer be mitigated by brief periods of rest or obscured by the strategic tailoring of his choir robes. To those observing him outside the immediate protective ring of his management, the visible changes were alarming and undeniable. The physical architecture of the man was collapsing. The robust, commanding figure who had historically dominated the stage with an almost gravitational physical presence was rapidly deteriorating. He experienced severe, unexplainable weight fluctuations. The legendary stamina that once allowed him to direct multi-hour recording sessions and command massive convention halls was entirely gone, replaced by a chronic bone-deep exhaustion. Yet the immense corporate machinery of the Gospel Music Workshop of America and the Cornerstone Institutional Baptist Church remained in perpetual motion, and that machinery required its figurehead. The tragic reality of Cleveland's final year was defined by the relentless demand for his physical presence, even as his body systematically shut down. The institution, desperate to project stability and safeguard its multi-million-dollar revenue streams, essentially forced him into a grueling, prolonged farewell tour disguised as business as usual. He was propped up for essential public appearances, his face heavily contoured with theatrical makeup to hide the severe wasting syndrome that is characteristic of late-stage immune deficiency. The most profound and heartbreaking documentation of this final period is not found in photographs or church bulletins, but in the audio records of his late career performances. Audio historians and musicologists who analyze his final recordings point to a drastic, undeniable shift in his vocal delivery. The famous baritone had always been raspy, but it had historically possessed an underlying formidable strength, a booming resonance that could cut through a 50-voice choir. By 1990, that underlying power had completely evaporated. What remained was a thin, labored, and profoundly fragile sound. The thematic focus of his final performances also narrowed with devastating precision. The energetic, triumphant anthems of his earlier years were largely abandoned. In their place, his repertoire became intensely focused on themes of finality, divine transition, and physical release. His vocal phrasing during these late recordings has been widely characterized by critics as a desperate, unfiltered plea for rest. When he sang lyrics requesting the Lord to take his hand or guide him across the river, it no longer sounded like a theological metaphor. It sounded like the literal, exhausted prayer of a man who was begging for permission to lay down a burden he could no longer physically carry. He was utilizing the microphone one last time to broadcast his suffering in the only language his congregation was permitted to hear. As 1990 bled into 1991, Cleveland's condition escalated from chronic decline to acute medical crisis. The sprawling Southern California mansion, which had for years functioned as his private, heavily guarded sanctuary, effectively transitioned into a highly secretive hospice. The logistics of managing his illness during this period required a monumental, coordinated effort of deception. In the early 1990s, the stigma surrounding AIDS was at its absolute zenith. The church administration understood that any leak regarding the true nature of his illness would result in a catastrophic media frenzy, immediately destroying his legacy and dismantling the financial security of his organizations. Therefore, the perimeter around the King of Gospel was tightly sealed. Access to his person was severely restricted, controlled entirely by a small elite cadre of trusted advisors, legal representatives, and high-ranking church officials. This containment strategy isolated Cleveland in his most vulnerable hours. The community he had built, the millions of fans he had comforted, and the vast network of musicians he had mentored were kept entirely in the dark, told only that the Reverend was suffering from severe respiratory issues brought on by a lifetime of tireless ministry. In late January 1991, as his respiratory systems began to definitively fail, Cleveland was admitted to Brotman Medical Center in Culver City, California. The hospitalization was handled with the utmost discretion. The protocols enacted around his hospital room mirrored the secrecy of a state intelligence operation. Only specifically vetted individuals were permitted entry. On February 9, 1991, the inevitable conclusion arrived. James Edward Cleveland died at the age of 59. The moment his heart stopped, the crisis management protocols of his religious empire were instantly activated. Within hours, official press releases were drafted, finalized, and disseminated to national news outlets. The church leadership stood before the press and a grieving nation to announce that the undisputed King of Gospel had passed away due to congestive heart failure. From a historical perspective, the use of this specific medical terminology is profoundly significant. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, before federal privacy laws strictly regulated the release of medical records, congestive heart failures and severe pneumonia functioned as a standard institutionally sanctioned medical codes for AIDS-related mortality. It was a linguistic shield utilized by prominent families, corporations, and religious institutions to preserve the dignity of the deceased and, more importantly, to protect the surviving entities from the severe sociological fallout of the epidemic. By officially citing heart failure, the church successfully bypassed immediate media scrutiny regarding his private life, ensuring that his obituaries focused exclusively on his musical genius and his orthodox religious devotion. However, the immediate aftermath of his passing in the walls of the hospital and the corridors of his estate was reportedly far from peaceful. When a figure of Cleveland's immense financial and institutional stature passes away, particularly an individual who leaves behind a complex multi-million-dollar estate with no legally recognized spouse or universally undisputed heir, the transition of power is rarely seamless. The days immediately surrounding his death were marred by dark, unsettling shadows and profound administrative anomalies. Historical accounts and investigative inquiries from individuals present during that chaotic window diverge significantly, but several concerning narratives have persistently circulated within the upper echelons of the gospel industry. It was widely understood among his inner circle that Cleveland's financial records, specifically the private ledgers detailing the intricate internal financial transactions of the Cornerstone Church and the GMWA, were highly complex. Following his death, unconfirmed reports suggested that several crucial financial documents and administrative files went inexplicably missing from his residence before an official audit could be conducted. More disturbingly, rumors began to permeate the gospel community regarding the specific circumstances of his final incapacitated hours. Many close to him noted that in the immediate wake of his passing, sudden, legally binding directives emerged regarding the transfer of his assets and the future leadership of his organizations. Whispers within the industry suggested that the dying man, in a state of severe physical weakness and diminished capacity, may have been pressured into executing documents that secured the financial control of the estate for specific individuals within his administration. These suspicions were further inflamed by quiet, persistent reports from individuals claiming to have viewed the body who alleged the presence of unexplained severe bruising. While these claims of physical coercion and administrative malfeasance were vehemently denied by the estate and were never definitively proven in a court of law, they cast a grim, indelible pall over the transition of his empire. The protective silence that the church had mandated to shield him in life had ultimately created an environment of total opacity in his death, an environment where, in the absence of transparency, rumors of opportunism and betrayal flourished. The king of gospel was gone, but the immense lucrative machine he had built was already ruthlessly recalibrating to survive without him, setting the stage for a catastrophic collision between the sanitized myth and the buried truth. The immediate aftermath of James Edward Cleveland's death in February 1991 was defined by a monumental, highly choreographed display of institutional grief. The ecclesiastical machinery that had governed his later years now pivoted seamlessly into managing his posthumous legacy. His funeral, held at the massive Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, was a testament to his unparalleled cultural footprint. It was a spectacular, hours-long event attended by thousands of grieving fans, prominent civil rights leaders, and the absolute elite of the American gospel and secular music industries. Choirs comprised of hundreds of voices sang the arrangements he had pioneered, their harmonies filling the cavernous space with a profound, overwhelming sorrow. During these services, the official, sanitized narrative of his life was permanently etched into the public record. Speaker after speaker stood before the microphone to eulogize a man who had sacrificed his physical well-being entirely for the spiritual uplift of his community. The designated medical explanation for his passing, congestive heart failure brought on by severe exhaustion, was universally accepted and repeated without question. To the millions of people watching the televised broadcasts or reading the obituaries in major newspapers, Cleveland had died exactly as he had lived, a flawless Orthodox servant who had simply run out of breath while doing the Lord's work. For exactly 12 months, this protective mythology held firm. The Cornerstone Institutional Baptist Church maintained its massive congregation, and the GMWA board members breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the King of Gospel was safely entombed with his secrets. This period of institutional calm, however, was merely the silent, pressurized withdrawal of water before a catastrophic tidal wave. In February 1992, the devastation arrived, not from a secular investigative journalist, but from deep inside the most guarded corridors of Cleveland's own private fortress. The catalyst for the collapse of the myth was a publication of immense cultural weight, Jet magazine was an institution within Black America. Founded in 1951, the pocket-sized weekly publication was the undisputed paper of record for the community, a staple in nearly every barbershop, beauty salon, and family living room across the nation. When Jet published a story, it bypassed traditional media gatekeepers and landed directly in the hands of the very demographic that comprised Cleveland's fiercely loyal fan base. In late February 1992, Jet hit the newsstands with a headline that sent an immediate paralyzing shockwave through the national religious landscape. The magazine detailed a massive civil lawsuit filed in the Los Angeles County Superior Court against the estate of the late James Cleveland. The plaintiff was a young man named Christopher Harris. Within the tight-knit circles of the gospel music industry, Christopher Harris was not an unknown figure. He was a former backup singer and a member of Cleveland's expansive choir network. More significantly, he was one of the young men who had lived inside the sprawling Southern California mansion, integrated into the Reverend's life under the socially acceptable, highly protective guise of an adopted son and musical protege. For years, the ecclesiastical hierarchy had utilized this specific narrative to explain away the presence of young men in the pastor's residence, framing it as an act of profound Christian charity and artistic mentorship. The legal filings submitted by Harris's attorneys violently dismantled this long-standing alibi. The lawsuit, seeking a staggering $9 million in damages from the Cleveland estate, presented a narrative that fundamentally contradicted every aspect of the public mythology surrounding the King of Gospel. According to the extensive civil complaint, Harris asserted that he was not an adopted son, nor was the relationship defined by religious mentorship. The lawsuit alleged that Harris and the late minister had been engaged in a highly secretive, continuous sexual relationship that spanned size of years, beginning in the mid-1980s and lasting until shortly before Cleveland's physical decline became incapacitating. The assertion of a long-term same-sex relationship involving the most powerful Orthodox religious figure in the country was on its own enough to trigger a massive institutional crisis. In 1992, the mere accusation of homosexuality was deeply stigmatizing, directing that accusation at a deceased pastor whose entire empire was built on conservative theological principles was perceived as an act of absolute sacrilege. However, it was the secondary claim within the lawsuit that elevated the situation from a posthumous moral scandal to a devastating legal and humanitarian nightmare. Harris alleged that during the course of their 5-year relationship, James Cleveland had knowingly and intentionally exposed him to the HIV virus. The legal filings explicitly stated that the minister was fully aware of his own positive medical status, yet deliberately withheld this critical, life-altering information from his partner during their intimate encounters. The explosive nature of these allegations cannot be overstated. By filing the suit, Harris was forcing the heavily guarded reality of the down-low culture out of the shadows and directly into the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light of the American judicial system. The lawsuit illuminated the severe inherent power imbalances that dictated the underground ecosystem of the gospel industry. It painted a grim portrait of a young, aspiring musician who was financially, professionally, and domestically dependent on a towering, multimillionaire patriarch. The legal narrative suggested that the protective walls of the mansion had functioned less as a sanctuary and more as a trap, where the extreme secrecy demanded by the church's homophobia created an environment ripe for exploitation and profound physical endangerment. The publication of the Jet magazine article triggered absolute panic within the boardrooms of the GMWA and the administrative offices of the Cornerstone Church. The crisis management protocols that had successfully guided them through Cleveland's death the previous year were entirely useless against a formalized legal assault that threatened the discovery phase of a public trial. If the lawsuit proceeded to open court, the estate would be forced to produce private financial records, medical histories, and sworn testimonies from individuals within Cleveland's inner circle. The carefully constructed lie of congestive heart failure would be legally dismantled, and the true cause of his death would become a matter of indisputable public record. For the everyday congregants, the choir members, and the millions of fans who had purchased his records, the lawsuit provoked a profound cognitive dissonance. They were confronted with an impossible theological and emotional contradiction. They were forced to reconcile the image of the man who had written "Peace Be Still," the man whose raspy voice had guided them through their darkest hours of grief, with the allegations of a man who utilized his immense wealth and power to conceal a fatal disease while allegedly jeopardizing the life of a young dependent. Furthermore, the Harris lawsuit operated as a devastating mirror reflecting the stark, unyielding hypocrisy of the institutional church back upon itself. For over a decade, conservative church leadership had utilized the pulpit to weaponize the AIDS epidemic, preaching that the virus was a moral scourge and a righteous punishment for a sinful lifestyle. Congregants had been taught to shun the afflicted. Yet the legal filings laid bare a terrifying institutional reality. The highest-ranking officials of the church, the men dictating these rigid moral codes and collecting millions in tithes, were allegedly navigating the exact same physical and psychological realities in secret. The lawsuit stripped away the veneer of spiritual invincibility, revealing an ecosystem where the wealth and power of the church were utilized not to comfort the sick or educate the vulnerable, but to protect its most prominent leaders from the very sociological terror they were helping to propagate. The bomb had detonated in the center of the sanctuary. The estate of James Cleveland was now facing the terrifying prospect of a highly publicized, drawn-out legal battle that would inevitably drag the darkest, most closely guarded secrets of the gospel music industry into the public domain. The institution was backed into a corner, realizing that their late founder's legacy and the financial empire attached to it were teetering on the edge of total, irreversible annihilation. The prospect of the Christopher Harris lawsuit advancing to a public trial presented an apocalyptic scenario for the James Cleveland estate, the gospel music workshop of America, and the broader conservative gospel industry. An open courtroom meant the initiation of the legal discovery process. It meant that medical records previously shielded by intense secrecy and compliant physicians would be subpoenaed and entered into the public domain. It meant that financial ledgers detailing the exact nature of the estate's spending and the internal logistics of maintaining Cleveland's hidden life would be exposed. Crucially, it meant that other individuals residing within the shadows of the down low network, choir directors, musicians, and administrative staff, could potentially be called to testify under oath, triggering a devastating domino effect that would shatter the institutional credibility of the entire denomination. Faced with the imminent threat of structural collapse, the ecclesiastical and legal machinery surrounding the estate executed a rapid, highly aggressive defensive maneuver. Their primary objective shifted entirely from defending the Reverend's posthumous honor to executing absolute damage control. The strategy was simple, cold, and legally absolute. The lawsuit could not, under any circumstances, reach a courtroom. Behind closed doors, far from the scrutiny of Jet Magazine or the congregation of Cornerstone Institutional Baptist Church, intense negotiations commenced. The estate utilized the one weapon it possessed in overwhelming abundance: the massive financial reserves accumulated during Cleveland's decades of dominance. The specific granular details of these negotiations remain permanently hidden, locked away in sealed legal archives. However, it is a matter of historical record that the civil lawsuit initiated by Christopher Harris was abruptly settled out of court. The settlement was not a quiet agreement, it was a legally binding fortification. The financial payout provided to Harris, while undisclosed, was undoubtedly substantial enough to secure his immediate withdrawal of the complaint. More importantly, the settlement was contingent upon the signing of rigorous, ironclad, non-disclosure agreements. By signing these documents, Harris and his legal representation were permanently forbidden from publicly discussing the nature of his relationship with James Cleveland, the allegations of HIV transmission, or any details surrounding the settlement itself. This legal maneuver effectively neutralized the immediate threat. The estate had successfully deployed its vast resources to purchase the silence of the accuser, purchasing a legal lid to slam down over the Pandora's box of the gospel industry's underground realities. With the lawsuit officially dismissed and the NDAs firmly in place, the crisis management team transitioned from damage control to historical reconstruction. What followed in the late 1990s and through the early decades of the 21st century was one of the most comprehensive and effective campaigns of historical whitewashing in the history of American music. The institutional church, working in tandem with the GMWA and the managers of his musical catalog, systematically scrubbed the narrative of James Cleveland's life. The objective was to completely erase the complex, agonizing duality of his existence and restore the monolithic, sanitized myth of the living saint. Official biographies commissioned by religious publishing houses rigidly adhered to the authorized timeline, focusing exclusively on his vocal innovations, his charitable work, and his unwavering dedication to the ministry. Retrospective documentaries and televised tributes broadcast on religious networks were heavily curated. They featured extensive interviews with choir members and fellow pastors who tearfully recalled his spiritual generosity, but they meticulously avoided any mention of his private life, the adopted sons who lived in his mansion, or the devastating realities of the AIDS epidemic that swept through his choirs. Most significantly, the true cause of his death was permanently obscured. The original manufactured narrative of congestive heart failure was cemented into the official historical record. The systemic hypocrisy of the era, the tragic reality of an institution that utilized its pulpits to stigmatize AIDS while using its wealth to shield a dying leader from that very stigma, was entirely excised from the church's collective memory. The man was reduced to a two-dimensional icon, a flawless vessel for divine music, stripped of his profound human suffering. Today, the legacy of James Edward Cleveland is towering, inescapable, and fundamentally haunted. It is impossible to engage with modern gospel music without encountering the architectural foundations he laid. His arrangements, his vocal techniques, and his structural innovations remain deeply embedded in the DNA of contemporary R&B, soul, and spiritual music. He is rightfully celebrated as a musical giant, a genius who provided a vital, enduring soundtrack of resilience for a marginalized community navigating the brutal realities of the 20th century. However, when one listens closely to the surviving audio recordings of his peak era, when one pays attention to the heavy, melancholic chord progressions and the agonizing, raspy desperation in his voice, on tracks like I Don't Feel No Ways Tired, a deeper, tragic, historical truth breaks through the sanitized narrative. His music was indeed a coded confession, an auditory diary of a man trapped in an impossible paradox. The true story of James Cleveland is not merely a biography of a gifted musician. It is a profound historical document detailing the catastrophic human cost of systemic homophobia and institutional hypocrisy. He was a man who possessed the power to command millions, yet lacked the basic freedom to live truthfully. He built a magnificent, sprawling sanctuary of sound where entire communities could lay down their burdens. But the rigid, unforgiving empire of faith he constructed ultimately provided no safe harbor for its architect. He was forced to endure the absolute worst of a devastating epidemic in complete isolation. His immense suffering deemed a liability by the very system that profited from his voice. The ultimate tragedy of his legacy is that the price he paid to become the undisputed king of gospel was to die hidden in the shadows, his true self permanently exiled by the institution he spent his entire life serving.